esteemed colleague, Mr. Robin Phillips.
I wanted to give my talk in here because if I get hungry I can have some oat cake. Well, thank you all for coming and for letting me give this talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart, George MacDonald and the life of gratitude. So one of the things that is puzzling is that even though George MacDonald's books were bestsellers in Victorian Britain, he has been comparatively neglected by historians. For example, Julie Melineck's 2008 book, Victorian Religion, Faith and Life in Britain, doesn't mention MacDonald even once. And even more puzzling, the 1,000-page Macmillan volume of Victorian prose doesn't mention him at all. And one of the areas that I feel he's been neglected in, and which I'm trying to redress in this talk and in my publishing efforts, is George MacDonald's function as a prophet of well-being, a spiritual psychologist who really shows us how to flourish and how to become more fully human. So what does human flourishing look like? This was a question that was largely neglected within the modern discipline of psychotherapy, that we associate with people like Freud and so forth. There tended to be a predominant emphasis on everything that can go wrong with a human person, what we might call abnormal psychology. See if I can get this to work here. There we go. But in the 20th century, with the positive psychology movement, people began to study, they began to ask, what do things look like when things go right? Instead of just focusing on abnormality and neurosis, scientists and psychologists began researching what things look like when they're going like they're supposed to go. And we have very sophisticated tools for measuring that now. And one of the things that the positive psychology movement, as it joins with contemporary neuroscience, one of the things that they're finding is that many of the assumptions that we have about flourishing are false. And one of these assumptions is the idea of self-esteem. I have here a cat.
Oh, that's good. That's good. What'd you say?
So in the 80s, which was the heyday of secular humanism, based on theories at the time, the state of California thought that if they could just increase self-esteem in school children, it would solve a lot of problems. It would cause bullying to go down, cause grades to go up. And so they poured thousands of dollars into boosting self-esteem. And it was a complete disaster because they found that self-esteem has a number of negative side effects. And we can talk more about that in the question and answer if you want. But within the peer-reviewed literature, it's very well established now that self-esteem comes with negative side effects, including egotism. Another secular humanist myth about flourishing is that you just have to follow your heart. Here's somebody, lady telling a man to just follow your heart. And this is also that we need to just be true to ourselves. And this type of thinking comes easy to us as Americans because we've been primed to consider the pursuit of happiness as a basic human right up with the pursuit of life and liberty. But ironically, the pursuit of happiness often generates unhappiness. And people have actually done studies to prove this. Susan David is a psychologist with the Harvard Medical School. Doesn't she look like the sort of psychologist you just want to tell all your troubles to? She wrote this book, Emotional Agility, where she cited a string of peer-reviewed studies. She didn't do the research, but she curated a lot of it in this book. A lot of the research showing that the pursuit of happiness is actually self-defeating. And in one of the studies, she showed that the higher people rank happiness as one of their objective goals, the more miserable they tend to be in daily self-evaluations. And the conclusion of this research is that genuinely happy people, I'm going to say joyful people, genuinely joyful people are those who have given up the pursuit of happiness and learned to be content in all circumstances, including the circumstance of not being happy. And so it's really exciting to see research catching up to Scripture. Here's Paul telling us, I've learned whatever state I am to be content. And so that is what flourishing looks like. The research as well as biblical teaching is showing that contentment, thankfulness, gratitude, these are the components, some of the components of a flourishing life. Now, one of my favorite researchers who has done work on this is Dan Gilbert. And he actually has a laboratory where he studies happiness. I didn't know that they had these things, but he has a lab where he studies happiness. And in his laboratory research, he's discovered that there are two types of happiness. And these are his definitions. You can call it whatever you like, but what he calls natural happiness is the sort of happiness you receive when you get what you want. So if you want a certain car or a good job or a soulmate and you get the object of your desire, you feel happy. But then there's another sort of happiness that he discovered in his lab, which he calls synthetic happiness. The definitions aren't important. What's important is the content of this, and this is the type of happiness you make for yourself when you don't get what you want, but your attitude is still one of contentment. Now, the really interesting part of his research is he found that sometimes it takes deprivation in the realm of natural happiness to cause somebody to produce the type of joy that you make for yourself through contentment when you don't get what you want. And he found that when a person's external world becomes unusually restricted, it often forces them to realize resources for contentment and joy available within their own hearts, resources that they might not have accessed if things had remained easy and without suffering. And he has a great TED Talk about this that you can find. And I actually first watched the TED Talk in 2015 when I was in Cullen. How many people have been to Cullen? Oh, okay. So I arrived in Cullen a few days before flying down to London to complete my doctorate. I was going before a committee to be examined for the PhD thesis that I spent 5 years working on. And I had 2 academic posts lined up to go into after I had passed the final formality of my doctorate. And to everyone's surprise, including the surprise of my department, the committee rejected my PhD thesis. And this coincided with some other things that were simultaneously happening to cause some devastation in my personal life, including debilitating mental exhaustion. And so after receiving the devastating news, I went to a monastery in Essex, England, and I took some pictures while I was there. And I just spent 8 days on a spiritual retreat, just praying and seeking the Lord's will for the rest of my life. And in some of the ancient texts that I found in the monastery library, as well as through a lot of the conversations that I had with the other pilgrims there, the Lord kept bringing up the whole theme of gratitude and also reframing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It was like the Lord was trying to tell me something. And after I left the monastery, I continued to dig deeper into the spirituality of gratitude as I was just trying to figure out how I was going to reframe my life. And the Lord really gave me the opportunity to start trying to put in practice some of the things that He was teaching me at this monastery and in the research some of the research I had been dabbling in to do with the neurophysiology of gratitude. And so returning to the United States, I built back up my professional life as a freelance writer. And for the next couple of years, I was just going all out, writing for businesses and for websites and for doing some ghost writing just for clients that would pay. And my dad was always saying, hey, you need to write another book, you need to write another book. I was like, I can't afford to take time to write a book because I was just living month to month with, from the paychecks. And finally in 2007, he said, I'd like to hire you to write a book. You can write a book about anything you want. He said that he would pay me per hour. And while I continued to work for the other clients as well. So I decided to return to some of these themes that I'd learned about gratitude. But I wanted to explore it from the point of view of people who were suffering. And to ask, how do these principles apply to people who are in deep pain? How can you experience the good life even when everything is going wrong? And the book finally got done, and it's coming out next year with Ancient Faith Publishing. So keep an eye out for it. But
What's the name?
It's called How to Experience the Good Life Even When Everything is Going Wrong. And as I was researching this book, George MacDonald was my constant guide because he suffered very much during his life. And providing for 11 children was always difficult, even when his books really began to sell. And witnessing the death of 4 of his children was even more difficult. And he also experienced physical suffering himself with bronchitis, with asthma, with eczema, and yet, as well as periods of spiritual dryness and depression and even doubt sometimes. And yet, in all of these trials, his attitude remained one of constant gratitude and contentment to God. And it wasn't just that he was thankful in spite of the challenges that were happening. He was thankful to God for the actual suffering because he believed that everything that was happening, even the difficult things, were being used to make him more like Christ. And I have some quotes from him. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to read them because I have some show and tell. I'm going to be passing out some quotes in a minute, so we're going to go over the quotes quite quickly. But one of the things that impressed me about his work on gratitude was that hardship and contentment, it's not like a teeter-totter, where, because it's easy to assume that you increase in contentment as hardship decreases. I was going to use the analogy of a zero-sum game, but we'll just talk about a teeter-totter. And he shows that you can increase in contentment even when your hardships are on the rise, if you leverage suffering for spiritual growth. And one of the ways that he was able to leverage suffering for spiritual growth is to realize that all suffering is redemptive. It's something that the Lord lets us go through to make us more like Jesus. And so imagine for a moment how you would feel if every single person in the world had their attention continually focused on arranging things for your benefit. So every single person in the world, 100% of the time, is trying to arrange everything for your benefit. You would never need to feel anxiety, you would feel constant peace, but each one of us is in a better position than that because God does not allow anything to happen to us that is not for our benefit. Not what we want, but what we need to bring us to where He wants us to be. He loves us so much that He uses everything that happens to us to make us more like His Son, Jesus Christ. And He does not let anything happen to us that cannot be used to make us more like Jesus. And that is the foundation of gratitude, our Heavenly Father's love. And so when all is said and done, why should I be grateful? Because I have a Father in heaven who loves me and He will not let me encounter anything that cannot be used to propel me closer to Him. And this enables us to reframe everything we encounter, even the difficult things, to reframe the negative things in our life in a way that emphasizes God's care and providence. So, and reframing occurs in our minds as we replace negative cognitions with positive thoughts that are rooted in reality. I'm going to skim over these quotes quickly in the interest of time because I'm going to pass them out on a handout that I have. But I made some examples here of negative frames, negative ways that we can describe our life, followed by positive frames. So, these trials are ruining my life and making me miserable. Or, James tells me I keep to count trials as pure joy because they lead to perseverance and maturity. Praise God for another opportunity to grow spiritually. And on and on. Everything that happens to us can be reframed in a positive way. There's nothing that cannot be reframed like this. Now, reframing, the only reason that this reframing is valuable spiritually is because the positive frames are true. They're rooted in God's promises. So you will not grow spiritually if you disrupt negative cognitions with thoughts of rainbows and chocolate and bunny rabbits. That is the era of sentimentalism. We have a sentimentalist painting. I don't like Eric Kincaid.
What's that?
Yeah, and in my book, I have a whole chapter about sentimentalism, and deal with some really messy topics. Talk about vulnerability and being able to lean into your pain and not suppressing pain, and some of the dark sides of human experience. But positive reframing. Yeah, the thing about these frames on the right is that they're true. It's not just that they're positive, it's that they get the truth of reality. And what you think about your life, when you think true thoughts, it actually changes the neurocircuitry of your brain on a neurophysiological level. Science is showing us what Rick Hansen says here. Moment to moment, the flows of thoughts and feelings, sensations and desires, and conscious and unconscious processes sculpt your nervous system like water, gradually carving furrows and eventually gullies on the hillside. Your brain is continually changing its structure. Actually, physically, neurophysiologically, the brain is constantly changing. The only question is it changing for better or for worse? In particular, because of what's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity, whatever you hold in your attention has a special power to change your brain. Attention is like a combination of spotlight and vacuum cleaner. it illuminates what it rests upon and then sucks it into your brain and yourself.
Wow. Wow.
So when I was writing this book, as I was looking at how sufferings can be leveraged for spiritual growth, one of my guides was St. John Chrysostom. And here he is, the 5th century saint, a biblical teacher, preacher, and psychotherapist. So he made an enemy of the Eastern Roman Empress Eudoxia, and hoping to silence his biblical teaching, she sent her soldiers to carry him into exile. And his colleague, the Deaconess Olympia, that was very close to him and that he was a mentor and therapist to, she fell into very deep depression and wrote him a series of letters. It was a very difficult time for her, being separated from him. And in these letters, he wrote to her to encourage her about how she could reframe her sufferings in positive terms and how she could retain a posture of gratitude in the midst of everything that was going on around her. And for many years, these letters had never been translated into English. They were in Greek. But then a George MacDonald fan translated them into English. A Michael Phillips fan, no less. So I was at a lecture that he was giving in North Idaho about this work, and when he heard my name, he said, "You're not by any chance related to Michael Phillips, are you?" And he explained that George MacDonald had been instrumental to him coming back to Christianity.
Wow.
And we're the beneficiaries of that because we have this translation. And I read through the book and wrote down 9 of his points about how suffering can be leveraged for spiritual growth. And they're pretty deep. I'm going to put them here on the PowerPoint, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on these because I've made some bookmarks. My dad helped me make some bookmarks. So we're going to add on the back are some of the George MacDonald quotes about gratitude that I skimmed over, so you can take your time to really study these. So if we can pass them out. We're going to skim over these quickly, but do take a look at the bookmarks. Now, these are not actual quotes from the book. These are my summaries of the teaching within the letters. And one of the things that he kept coming back to was gratitude. Now, as I was looking at this teaching of George MacDonald, which you have on the back of there, as you look at St. John Chrysostom's teaching, one of the things that I wanted to know was, is gratitude an emotion, or is it something you do? Because there are spiritual emotions like compassion, like contrition, like peace, like joy. These are spiritual emotions. But there's also spiritual virtues that you just have to get out and do, regardless of how you feel. So I was wondering that about gratitude, and light was shed on this question by researcher Brene Brown. See if I can get to the next slide here. She said that gratitude is a practice. Now, her research, when she was researching for her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, she shared how she had devoted hundreds of hours to analyzing thousands of interviews that she had done with joyful people. And before analyzing the data, she had assumed that joyful people were naturally grateful. But in the research, some patterns began to emerge here. See if I get my mouse to work here. There we go. This is what she said. Without exception, every person I interviewed who described living a joyful life, or who described themselves as joyful actively practiced gratitude and attributed their joyfulness to their gratitude practice. When it comes to gratitude, the word that jumps out to me throughout this research process is practice. Now, she says that gratitude is like dieting or yoga. She said she knows people who, she said that she has a yoga attitude, but that doesn't mean she goes and does it, or a dieting attitude or exercise attitude. It won't get you anywhere if you don't actually practice it. And gratitude practices include things like gratitude journaling, making a point to thank people you appreciate, maybe doing something like committing not to complain or criticize family members, reframing, we talked about that. Other things, you can imagine what your life would be like if certain things were taken away, and then thank God that you have those things, maybe things you take for granted. There's all these sorts of practices you can engage in to increase gratitude. And in my forthcoming book, I talk about a number of those with some real life examples. And this is important because gratitude is an emotion, but the way that you create the conditions for the emotion of gratitude to emerge is through these practices. And this emphasizes something that we find again and again in MacDonald's spiritual psychology, which is a web of multiple reciprocities and feedback loops between behavior, emotions, and thoughts. The behavior informs your emotions and your thoughts, which then feed back in to making behavior easier and so forth. And if you engage in correct behavior by doing your duty in the next 5 minutes, then over time, this helps to inform your emotions and thoughts. But George MacDonald also spent enormous time on thoughts because he realized that correct thoughts about God can help to inform behavior. And through the imagination, he appealed to the emotional side by helping people feel desire to serve and obey God. And this last point, I talked a little bit about in last year's address, and which I've also talked about in my Northwind article, which is available online. I want to open questions, but I want to just give a little commercial first for my podcast. I have a podcast. We've been doing some work on virtue and philosophy, and you can check that out at my website. And then finally, I have this interesting. I can't remember what it was. Would you like to explain about this? It's a plaque that was in my dad's house as he was growing up.
That I have a tiny little picture of my mom as a little girl crying about something, and then this little saying right above it. And it was in our kitchen all my life growing up. And it just really had an impact on me, and now it's in our kitchen, and that's just one of the most wonderful quotes in the world, and it just kind of summarizes everything Robin has been talking about.
All right. This means that you can ask questions now. Got it.
Okay.
Yes, Richard.
Something. I know next week, next month is Thanksgiving, right? Which we always think is an American holiday, but it occurred to me a little while back. We didn't invent this; Christianity did. It's a Christian holiday, and we do it every week. And I know the Greek word for Thanksgiving is Eucharistia, and we use that word in English as Eucharist. And the Eucharist is the worship service. This is what Orthodox do, and the Catholics sort of, and a lot of Protestants have gotten away from it. Some churches do it once a month or 4 times a year, but the Orthodox do it every single Sunday. Every time there's a liturgy, there's a Eucharist. And it's always Thanksgiving. There's the whole thing. The whole thing is a prayer service for Thanksgiving, and we receive the body and the blood. And it's like, I realized that, and I thought, this whole life is Thanksgiving. That's what Christianity is, basically. Which is, and people don't understand this anymore. They've gotten away from it so much.
Yeah, Alexander Schmemann has a great book about that called For the Life of the World. How many people have read that? 3, 4. Good. Somebody had a question over here?
I didn't have a question, just a comment. My Ollie's sister is dealing with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. So we don't know how much longer she has. They can't operate. She's been doing chemo, but her updates and her, when she's talked to us in person, is just amazing. And she gathered us all together one time. Never a complaint from her. Just always trying to do whatever I can do today, I will do with all my strength. In other words, some days she has more energy than others. But she wears a bracelet now. It's just a little plastic thing. And she says, whenever I complain, it has to move to the other wrist. And the idea is to keep it on my wrist for a long time without having to switch it. And she passed them all out to us, but I'm not wearing mine, I'm sorry. I gave up.
Pass out a lot of those to corporations, and even I think the Pentagon has got involved with the program.
Really?
Because to all these people trying to go 21 days without complaining.
Yeah, that's what
And
it was.
every time you
Yeah.
complain, you have to set it back. Now, I don't actually fully agree with that because I think complaining can sometimes be helpful as a way of processing pain. They found that I think it was at Harvard Medical School. Some hospital, they took a group of women who were dying from breast cancer, and then they had another group, and the one group was able to talk to each other and to hug and to cry with each other, to let people know, to let each other know about their fears, insecurities, and then the other group, for not for experimental reasons, that'd be unethical, but for I can't remember why, but they didn't have the same opportunity to share how they were feeling. And the group who were able to talk to each other about, even share their darker feelings and complain and hug and cry and be vulnerable together, they lasted a lot longer before they died. So, but I would say 90% of the complaining we do only makes us feel worse, and it encourages the attitude of grumbling. And that's what corporations find. They work better and are more profitable when the people have a positive attitude, and they try to go 21 days without complaining. So there you go. Somebody else? Jason?
I'll try to formulate this question right, but we've been growing, and I've been growing in some new areas of trying to think through healing and approaching the Lord repeatedly for healing. And some people I've talked to, it's almost like they don't have any place for any space in their theology, I should say, for God not healing them. And I ask, well, what if He doesn't heal you? Does God not love you? And their answer, in my experience, has always been, it's a mystery, I don't know, but I'm not going to stop asking God to heal me. Whereas, my question is, what do you think of that? And do you think asking for healing is like the wrong thing? Or how does this teaching and understanding of gratitude work with that?
Well, yeah, I don't think you were here. In yesterday's session, my dad gave a talk about how prayer actually can change God's mind.
Oh, I did hear that.
Oh, you were, okay, you were here. Good. We should definitely pray for healing and so forth. But so I was at a church once. It was at Fairwood, and they had no theology of suffering. And so whenever somebody was sick, or especially if somebody was terminally ill, they thought, oh, something's wrong. It must be the devil. It must be because we're not praying enough. It must be because I'm not fasting enough. And then when somebody dies, it's just like, people lose their faith or despair or get depressed. And so having a theology of suffering, and that sometimes God's plan is not to heal people, that's just as important as believing that He's able to heal people. I don't know if that really answers your question. I think, yeah. So in Americans don't really have a theology of struggle either. We don't know what to do with struggle. There's been a lot of cross-cultural anthropological research about this, and even outside theology, they found that Americans just don't know what to do with struggle. And we can talk more about that. Does that sort of address your question? In my book, I have part of a chapter where I talk about the prosperity gospel and all the problems with that. Mom?
I'm just recently reading something you wrote about holiness, and you used a word that the Russians have that we don't have a word for. It started with a P.
Politic.
Yeah, and it put struggling in a whole different category.
Yeah, so the Russians actually have a word for spiritual struggle. It's called podvig. And yeah, I have an article that I wrote for Touchstone magazine where I talk about this, and where I put it within the terms of cross-cultural psychology and anthropology, and what they've found about how struggle, hardship are generally approached within Anglo-American cultures.
But didn't you say that they actually see struggle as a positive thing in their lives?
Yeah. So in Japan, in the Asian countries, certainly not all the Asian countries, but in Japan, Thailand, parts of China, struggle is perceived positively, and there were some researchers that went over to a Japanese classroom. They were studying 8th grade math in Japanese classrooms versus American classrooms, and there was this child who was having trouble with this math problem, so the Japanese teacher brought him in front, made him stand before the whole class on the blackboard, and he struggled through the whole thing. All the eyes were on him, and the American who was videoing this for his research got more and more anxious on behalf of this person. So why are they doing that? And then when he finally got it right, the boy had a big grin on his face. The class cheered. He went and sat down in his seat. That child was being honored because he was struggling, and in the Japanese culture, that's positive. And in Anglo-American spirituality, going back to the Kazakh movement, I think that struggles, but there were a number of 19th century devotional writers who said that struggle and human effort and hardship were all signs of the Holy Spirit not working in your life. I have a string of quotes I can show you, and this has got into our bloodstream, especially more so in America, but where there's other cultural factors that play into these illusions.
I wanted to share a comment. I really appreciated what you shared from your personal experience about a really painful time that you went through involving your thesis and when things were going on in your personal life. And
by the way, I want you to tell them that I reject their rejection.
And, oh no, you're fine. And the healing that you experienced at the monastery. And I just wanted to share from personal experience and what I appreciate too about this. And remind me of the title of your book that's coming out next year.
How to experience the good life even when everything is going wrong.
And I like that, and I'm looking forward to reading that. And so I appreciate what you said through this. You've called it this theology of suffering, and how through the struggles and pain and questions that we have, and how you correlate your admiration of George MacDonald and reading him and using him as a model. So, and it just reminds me of why we're all here, is because through his writings we've discovered some truth or been moved by it. You know, people discover MacDonald through Lewis or Chesterton, Madeline L'Engle, Friedrich Baker Tolkien, or whomever. And I'll give an example from my own personal life about when you were talking about the suffering a couple years after my conversion years ago, I thought everything would be sort of plain sailing how wrong I was. And, I went through a dark night of the soul a couple of years after that, and it shook me to the core. I thought it would destroy me. I didn't reject the goodness and love of the Creator, but I really questioned it. And it is rather odd to say, I'm thankful for going through that dark night of the soul years ago. But if I had not gone through that, I would have never had the rich life experiences that I've had in my life that I feel so undeserving of. And my book, Surprised by Agape, came out of that. And one reason, and I appreciate you taking the effort to write yours, and it just reminds me that sharing our stories is, like Henry Nouwen put it, we're wounded healers. And I think that's an amazing thing that you have done and that you've done through your book. And that's what I wanted to do, remind us to try to, especially with I fight clinical depression, which is hard for me because I love life, I love community and music and literature and art and all these incredible things, and it's just it's a sickness, you know. And thank goodness there's counseling and medication and community and mentors and things that one can do to stay in a holistic place. But and a couple things that you said hit me. It's just like sometimes, and the gentleman over there as well. Sometimes I've prayed sometimes that I wish God would heal me, but this is probably a fight I'll have to fight for the rest of my life. But it's worth it because, as you have expressed, His agape love is greater than the darkness and the struggle, and the pain out of it can come joy and healing and community. So I appreciate your lecture, and I'll look forward to reading.
Thanks for here. Oh, time, yes. Thank you. Great contribution.
You got to run fast to stay ahead of your son.
I don't know if I'm ahead of him anymore. Yeah, he may have already passed me up. So we're going to have a break. So I don't want to have to badger everybody. Be back in there at 10 after 4.